Hello, Alvin ISD mathematicians. Today we're going to be summarizing data, which is our 6th grade standard of 612D. So how are we going to do that? We'll actually be summarizing categorical data instead of numerical data, and we'll do that using a frequency table and a percent bar graph. Now, a frequency table, you should recognize this. You've been using this since elementary school, but today percent bar graphs will be new to you. So let's jump on in. This will be our learning target, so you'll know you've gotten today's lesson when you can transfer the frequency table into the percent bar graph. So we're going to talk about my hat collection for a second, because I love hats. So on the next slide, you're going to see my hat collection. And I want you to kind of just take a mental thought of what kind of hats do you see? How many hats of each do you see? And even, do you like what you see maybe? All right. So here's my hat collection. And on the next slide, we're going to make a frequency table of how many of each type of hat there are. So I will let you know that we have visors, cowboy hats, baseball caps, and sombreros. So I want you to take this time to pause your video and count up how much you see of each type of hat. Once you've done that, please join us again. All right, guys, let's move on. So now we're going to build our frequency table. So in our hat collection, there was only one visor. So that frequency was 1. Now for cowboy hats, there was 2. We had 4 baseball caps. And then there were 3 sombreros, which gives us a total of 10 hats. So now we're going to move over here to this word, relative frequency. Now what this actually is it's the ratio of each part out of the whole, but it needs to be expressed as a decimal. So for our visor, we had 1 out of all 10 that were visors. So that represents 1/10, which I can write as a decimal as 0 and 1/10. Now my cowboy hat represented 2 out of 10 total hats, which represents 2/10 as a decimal. My baseball caps were 4 out of 10, which leaves me with 4/10 as a relative frequency. And then my sombreros were the remaining 3 out of my 10 total hats, which gave me 3/10. All right, notice our relative frequency adds up to a total of 1, just like our fractions do. That's interesting because as we move forward, we're going to be thinking about this notion of what the whole means and having parts of wholes and percents out of the 100, which represents the whole. And in this case, this 10, the total number of hats I had, represents my whole collection. So it would make sense that my fractions of them, of the parts, and then my relative frequencies should sum to 1 because that represents the entire thing, the entire hat collection. All right, guys, so now I want you to take a moment and click on our Cuisenaire rods because we're going to actually use these to build out a strip diagram to show us the parts of each type of hat in relation to the total of my hat collection. So go ahead and click that, and once you're ready to go. All right, we're going to start by representing my entire hat collection, which was just 10 hats. So I'm going to show that by each one of my gray squares represents 1 hat. image that really doesn't break down what kind of hats I had, what I had more of. So now I'm going to take it a step further. And I want to use different colors to represent each type of hat. So I'll start with my visor, which I had only one of. So gray will represent my one. Well, but then I had 2 cowboy hats. So red represents 2. I had 4 baseball caps. So I'll use pink to represent that. And then I had 3, the remaining 3 hats were my sombrero. Notice my parts still match up to my whole. In a moment, guys, we're going to move back into my slideshow, but you can still stay on here because this will be transferred to what we're looking at. All right, if you notice, this is the same image from what we were just working with our Cuisenaire rods. So now we're going to actually take our strip diagram and transfer this to what we call a percent bar graph. So I know my total represented 10 hats, but that also represented 100% of my entire collection. So if it represented 100% of my entire collection, then each one of my tiles will be 10%. And if you're thinking, oh, hey, this looks really familiar, it's because this is exactly the same kind of strategies that we've been using when we solve ratios and rates and problems with proportions. So now if we look at the first block, my visors, because I only had one, represented 10% of my collection. So I'm going to use gray to color that to match our bar graph so far. So I'm going to go from 0 to 10%. Well, now the next part represents 20%, and that's our cowboy hats, because we had 2 out of our 10. So I'm going to use red. And if cowboy hats represent 20%, I'm actually going to have to build that on top of the 10% I already have. So I will go from 10% all the way to 30%, because that represents the 20% that we have of cowboy hats. And now I'm going to use that same thinking with my baseball caps, because 4 out of 10 were baseball caps. That represents 40%. So for 40% to transfer onto my percent bar graph, I have to start at 30% now. And if I add 40% onto 30%, that takes me all the way to 70%. And now lastly, we have our sombreros, which we had 3 of, so it represents 3 out of 10, which represents 30%. And notice, when I go to add on my 30%, I have to start at 70%. That additional 30% takes me all the way to 100%. Our percent bar graphs should never come out to something that is not 100%, because it's always going to represent our whole. All right, so I want you to take a moment, pause this, and then go ahead and fill out the frequency portion of the column. And when you're done, come back. All right, so popcorn had a frequency of 4. Nachos had 16. Hot dogs had 8. Hamburgers had 7. And then candy had 15. Now, I'm going to have to find my total frequency, because I know I'm going to need to find my percent. So when I add up all of my frequencies, I get that there was a total of 50. So to find my percent, I know that part over whole is always equal to percent out of 100. So when I look at 4 out of my 50, I know that that needs to be equivalent to my percent out of my 100. And since these are equivalent ratios, I can think multiplicatively. So I see I can multiply 50 by 2 to get to 100. So then I can multiply 4 by 2 to get 8. So popcorn represents 8%. Now nachos had a frequency of 16 out of the 50 total, and I want to know what my percent out of 100 is. So I'm going to use the same thinking. So if I multiply 16 by 2, I get that nachos are 32%. And I'm going to continue that thinking for the remaining rows. Notice I used the same mathematical relationships every time. I was using equivalent ratios, and since my denominator stayed the same, because my total stayed the same, I multiplied both the numerator and the denominator by 2 to find all of my percents. So now I want to make my percent bar graph. So I'm going to give popcorn red, and popcorn represents 8%. So I'm going to start at 0 and go a little bit before 10 because I needed to show 8%. So now I have nachos, which are 32%, and I'm going to make purple. Well, if I'm starting at 8% and I need to add on 32%, that will take me all the way to 40%. Hot dogs, which are 8 out of the 50, make up a whopping 16% of our concession stand snacks. So if I'm starting at 40, which is where I left off, and I'm increasing by 16%, that will take me to 56%. And notice I'm using a key when I'm making my colors so that it helps me understand which color represents what snack. Our hamburgers are 14%. So if I'm starting off at 56% and I'm adding 14%, that takes me to 70%. And then lastly, our candy, if I'm starting at 70%, then adding on the additional 30 should take me all the way to the whole, which is 100%. And it does. When we look at percent bar graphs, we want to think about what our mode is. Now remember, with measures of central tendency, our mode is what occurs most frequently. So we can transfer that understanding and that definition to categorical data simply by looking at our graph, either the frequency part of our graph or the percent bar graph. I see that nachos had the most. And even on our percent bar graph, nachos have the greatest percent colored in. So the nachos would be our mode. All right, we're now here at our learning target. Go ahead and take a moment, pause the video, and attempt this problem on your own. Whenever you're done, please join us again to check your solutions. All right, welcome back, boys and girls. Notice I've included my key not only in the table itself over here, but also in the frequency table. Because I want us to kind of think about our fraction, decimal, and percent relationships that we learned in the very beginning of the year. If you have a very solid understanding of going from decimals into percents, you would not have even needed to total up your frequency and then convert using your proportional relationships, because they gave you the relative frequency already. And I know that 20 hundredths is the same as 20%. And 10 hundredths is the same as 10%, and etc. So I was easily able to just use my knowledge of converting between fractions, decimals, and percents to find that percent of frequency and then transfer it to the table. Now looking at the table, our mode is going to be Texas A&M because it occurs most frequently. It occupies the greatest percentage of the categorical data. Oops, not modest, mode. All right, thank you so much for learning with us today, boys.